Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a little bright, but I'll try to not be bothered by it. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for the chance to share a bit of my research with you today. I've had the pleasure of being in Japan this week and engaging with many government agencies and members of the quantum industry community as well here. And it's been a real pleasure to learn from them and take some notes to take back home with me, back to the United States when I go back. So before I start my talk, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Center for New American Security. So we're a policy research organization based in Washington, D.C., where we work on national security policy, broadly speaking. We're an independent bipartisan organization. We are not a part of government, but we seek to advise policymakers as they make decisions related to national security. So at CNAS, we have a bunch of different teams that focus on different areas of the national security landscape, and I'm specifically with the Technology and National Security team, where I focus almost exclusively on quantum technology. And for that, to me, that means finding ways in which we can strengthen American innovation and competitiveness in quantum technology, especially as it relates to implications, but also applications for national security and defense policy. So this is just showing you a screenshot of our website. We're at cnas.org, and you can find our publications there. Again, not just related to technology, but across the whole spectrum of national security policy. And if you navigate on our website, you can also find our publications related to quantum technology. So we have here, last year, a colleague published a report on the US-China competition in quantum computing. And I published a piece recently advising the new Trump administration on how to accelerate America's quantum technology leadership. But today, I'm excited to share a bit of a preview of an upcoming report that will be published in a couple of weeks that I authored. And this one's based or focused on quantum sensing for position, navigation, and timing. And I've been very excited to work on this. It's been a long time coming. And today should provide a bit of a preview into my findings and recommendations for policymakers in this space. So stay tuned for the actual release of the report in a couple of weeks. And I think here I wanted to make a point very clear about why I chose to focus on quantum sensing. I think generally you see, and I think many of us here, that's true as well, that quantum computing tends to get a lot of the attention when it comes to discussing quantum technologies for national security. And I contend in this report that by focusing on quantum sensing, it's not that we don't care about quantum computing, but it actually serves as a strategic priority, especially from a policy-making point of view, to solve very pressing national security issues like GPS denial, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it also receives very little private funding. And this is a big contrast to quantum computing that receives much more private investment. So I argue that that's a point where the government really has an important role to play in supporting quantum sensing. And in the end, I think if you think about it, if you focus on quantum sensing, you can also advance the broader quantum supply chain and broader quantum technology leadership. So with that, I think I want to share a bit of my findings on this. So first, introduce the problem of why we should care about next generation position, navigation, and timing as a national security priority, how quantum sensing can help, the strengths of the US quantum ecosystem in this respect, as well as the main challenges that we're facing. And then finally, a bit of recommendations for how to actually move forward and address those challenges. And then hopefully we'll have enough time for some questions at the end. So give me 1 second to get a bit of water here. Okay, so if we think about the problem of GPS denial, it's very easy to figure out why it's so important to national security. We're in a point where we really depend on GPS or satellite-based, so not just GPS, but other satellite-based navigation systems for almost everything we do. So this underpins our military, our critical infrastructure, and our daily life, and that's illustrated here. You can see different military platforms across different domains. You see for financial institutions, for synchronizing telecommunication networks, for data centers, including our phones to tell our time, right, and navigate for personal purposes as well. So GPS has really been such an incredible innovation that has enabled so much of our global economy, right? So that's an incredible invention, but it also poses a lot of vulnerabilities. So this is the negative side of GPS, right, where it can be easily spoofed and jammed. And it's vulnerable to all sorts of disruptions as well as attacks directly to the GPS infrastructure. So obviously this is a problem if we go back to thinking about, and I guess, sorry, I forgot I had the slide here, but this is making the point that it's not just a military problem, it's also starting to impact our civilian applications. So here it's showing commercial flights that have been affected by spoofing problems, especially in the past few years as we've had hot war scenarios in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. It can impact thousands of flights that are flying relatively nearby these combat zones. So it doesn't just impact the efficiency of military operations, but it's starting to affect civilian systems as well. And more broadly, if we go back to thinking all of the things that depend on GPS, if all of a sudden GPS or again, general satellite-based navigation systems were disrupted, we're in deep trouble, right? This is going to impact our national security, our public safety, our daily life is going to be disrupted. And some have estimated this to cost over $1 billion just for the American economy in daily losses. And some would argue that the cost would be a lot higher as well. So that motivates, okay, this is a problem we need to be solving. In my report, I focus on how quantum sensing can solve, at least help address some of those vulnerabilities. So why quantum sensors? So quantum sensors offer a very compelling alternative as local sources of high precision and resilient position navigation and timing, or PNT. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here. You probably know a lot about this technology, but just broadly speaking, these devices of different forms, in the end, use some combination of lasers and control electronics to manipulate and measure very subtle energy changes at the atomic level. And they use that to estimate time, to estimate acceleration, rotation, magnetic and gravity fields, etc., to determine then position, navigation, and timing for those applications. And relative to other alternatives, quantum sensors offer great advantages in precision, in long-term holdover, or in accuracy. They do not rely on, importantly to the point of GPS denial, they do not rely on external radio frequency signals that could be spoofed or jammed. And they also, compared to other alternatives for PNT, they also operate passively, so they enable stealthy operation, which is critical for certain military operations as well. And we're increasingly, very excitingly, I think, seeing that these sensors are increasingly field ready. So here I'm showing you a few providers from the United States that are already commercializing their optical atomic clocks. You see some here from Inflection and Vector Atomic. At the top there, you see the chip-scale atomic clock that has actually been commercialized for a number of years now, almost 2 decades. But there are some improvements to making that more precise as well and cheaper, which is critical for it to scale in commercial markets. So that's clocks, but you also see increasingly prototypes of atomic gyroscopes or nuclear magnetic resonance gyroscopes, so a different technique. You see advances in increasing field demonstrations on relevant military platforms of gravimeters and magnetometers. But nevertheless, these are still prototypes, and in best cases, these are just starting to be commercialized. But there are still some bottlenecks there for them to be adopted at a large scale. So there are some technical bottlenecks that I'm highlighting here, which have to do with continuing to enhance the robustness of the quantum states that these sensors rely on in very harsh environments, and especially if you start thinking about military platforms again, some of them being very small and dynamic, you need to be able to adjust for that and continue the performance of the sensors in those difficult environments. These need to continue to be miniaturized and integrated of these very complex systems of atomic, optical, and control components. You need to do all of that without sacrificing performance, right? And also reducing costs. So some of these systems, at the beginning, as with most technologies, at first they're very expensive. So you need to be able to then, in order to compete with other alternatives, you need to be cost competitive too. So my report focuses on how whether the United States can basically take that challenge and get these sensors all the way to the finish line. But I contend that also the lessons learned from my research and my report also apply more broadly to other countries too. So in my report, I look at a few different points where the United States really shines in the field of quantum sensing. And some of that is substantial government support for research and development. And here I'm highlighting the United States has a broader quantum strategy, the National Quantum Initiative, that was funded by the act that was passed in 2018. And that grows investments in quantum to $1 billion per year. We've seen here that, excuse me, the investments for sensing were about 1/4 of that money. And that's pretty comparable to what has been spent on quantum computing. So that's pretty positive, and by these various agencies that you see there. The United States leads in the impact of the research in quantum sensing.
そして米国の場合には量子センシングに関しても
The United States is not number one in the total number of publications. It's at the top in impact. We have 10 of the top 15 institutions are from the United States, and you see various representatives here. And another point to take here is that these universities are also very distributed across the United States, so it's good to see different representation from different regions in the United States. We have a growing industry ecosystem, so we have about 20 players that are working on quantum sensing development and solutions. And a lot of this work has been supported by the Department of Defense, that has really taken a leading role in bringing these sensors across different technology maturity levels and bringing them increasingly to relevant military platforms. That's also been a great initiative from the United States. Now for some challenges, right? So it's not all roses. So even though the United States receives the most private capital in quantum technologies around the world, most of that flows to quantum computing. And I was referring to that earlier as well. So only about 8% of that funding goes to quantum sensing, and about 80% goes to computing. So that's a huge difference in how much funding these technologies are receiving. Future US government funding is uncertain. So the main piece of legislation that I mentioned earlier, essentially the funding for that expired in 2023, and it has not been renewed yet. So that puts into question whether the government will continue to support quantum broadly, but including sensing at the levels that they had up until last year, I guess. And in the defense side of things, so that act does not cover defense spending. In the defense side of funding, we're seeing a bit of a trend there where some of the quantum sensing funding that gets requested by the DoD is being moved by Congress to fund quantum computing programs. So I think this reflects a bit of a conflation of different quantum technologies and not understanding that these are different applications with different maturity levels that both are important and need to be funded. They can't just be replacing one another. So those are problems. And then finally, I think most challenging for the United States is that there's limited access to supply chain components and specialized manufacturing. And I contend here, and I've been very interested to see where countries like Japan perhaps could offer some lessons in how the United States can become a more robust manufacturing player. Obviously, not having a robust supply chain and access to manufacturing capabilities makes the United States vulnerable to disruptions, and it really limits the transition from a prototype phase to a commercialized technology that then can then be offered and adopted in a large scale. So just to wrap up here, I think just to close with some recommendations, and I'm going to keep it surface level because I do want you to read the report. So I'm just going to share briefly what some of my recommendations are. And again, I encourage you to read the report for more detail or find me later and I'm happy to discuss that. So I think some of the things, they're not going to shock you, right? They're pretty intuitive, but some of the things that that I argue we need to continue to do from the United States is to continue to align and prioritize the funding and support for quantum sensing, and not just the funding, but the adoption of these technologies, and communicate that pretty clearly, because it's clear that because there isn't a lot of support from the private sector, that leads to a very weak market signal. And I think continuing to prioritize and express that the United States is interested in these sensors as a very useful national security tool can really go a long way with mobilizing the academic and industry ecosystem to continue to pursue those technologies. The second one is related to the first. We should continue to support these programs that accelerate tech readiness with rapid demonstrations. So I mentioned earlier briefly that the Department of Defense has some of these innovation programs that have really moved the needle in accelerating the development of various technologies, including quantum sensing. So I argue we need to continue to that and even expand that to other platforms to make sure that we continue moving at a fast pace and getting those to fruition sooner rather than later. Strengthening quantum supply chains and manufacturing. I mean, this is something that the United States has been trying to do in the past couple of years across many different critical and emerging technologies. Quantum is not an exception. And in fact, some of the components there are shared with other technology fields beyond quantum. I think there's something we need to continue to understand, both map the different components of the supply chain and think strategically what things we could try to build domestic capabilities for, in which we need to continue working with close allies and partners to ensure that we have access to those components, at least in the short term, as we continue to build domestic capabilities. Fourth, and very importantly, expand the civilian market for quantum sensors. So even if the Department of Defense, in the case of the United States, came in full force to support quantum sensors, they're only going to be able to buy so many. That's not going to be enough to sustain the industry for the long term. So really reaching out to the civilian market, starting with critical infrastructure providers to understand what their needs are and maybe what their reservations are in, or really just growing awareness of quantum sensors as a potential source of resilient PNT can go a long way. And here it doesn't even take a lot of government funding, just creating awareness and maybe fostering relationships with end users would really help, and helping maybe with standards, setting standards and test beds for quantum sensors. And then finally, if we think about the long term, we really want to also not just innovate for the short term, but ensure that we have a long-term sustainable ecosystem for research and talent to continue innovating in quantum sensors. So we must continue to support research and development programs in physics and engineering and quantum engineering, and growing the force, again, growing that talent pipeline to continue innovating for the long term. And finally, I don't cover this in detail in the report, but something that I'm very curious about, and the reason why I'm here too, is to understand, thinking beyond just the domestic US ecosystem, how can we set up strategic partnerships to continue working on these technologies together? And I think, again, I think you can think of how the international piece can fit into each of the other 5 recommendations. I think we can always think of a way in which having solid partnerships, and very strategic ones, can advance all the other ones and really get us to a point where we can bring the technology to maturity, and not just that, but actually making it a sustainable enterprise and continue to cultivate innovation in this domain. So with that, I'll just invite you again to look out for this report. It should come out at the end of May. And feel free to send me your feedback as well. I'd be happy to hear that and discuss further with you. Thank you.
We have time for one question, so if anyone has a question, yes.
Hi, my name is Arvind. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of Q Control. I think I have one point to make and one question to ask you. The point I wanted to make is we are seeing plenty of demand from the civilian from the civilian market. That's great. And in terms of international partnerships, what we found is AUKUS countries are fairly easy to collaborate with. As an example, we're working with Lockheed Martin, although we are headquartered in Australia, but we have a significant presence in the US. My question is what is the US doing in terms of easing the ability to partner internationally, especially with countries like Japan, which is part of the Quad, and what impact to export control? Once technology is ITAR controlled, then it becomes very hard to sort of, there are boundaries in which we have to work inside. So what's really happening there? Can you comment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of change with the new administration. I think that's just natural with any new administration. It's going to take a while for things to settle before we have good clarity in what their strategy will be in all things, but including quantum. I think, though, so far, even early on, we've seen very robust support for continuing quantum initiatives in the United States from the new Trump administration. That's been very encouraging, that even in a climate where President Trump is very focused on reducing government spending across the board, they have singled out AI and quantum as two strategic technologies where they want to continue to invest at the same levels that the country had been spending to date. And that, like I said, is has been about $1 billion per year, which is more than most countries. So that's encouraging to see. In terms of, and this is exactly, I think, part of the reason I'm here, is to try to figure out, going beyond that general interest, and firm interest, I would say that the administration has shown for quantum, what that means for the international collaboration piece. And, you mentioned AUKUS, so that's another piece that's not just quantum, but has a bit of a quantum component under Pillar 2. I haven't seen any pronouncements related to things changing on AUKUS from the new administration, but I think it's possible that things might change. I don't know. I don't want to make any. I also should reiterate, I do not represent the U.S. government, but I try to stay up to speed with what's going on there. So I think, I ultimately think, and I've been saying this in all my meetings here this week, is that it's really incumbent on our close partners and allies to make a very compelling case back to the United States government for why the United States should continue working with these allies and partners. And obviously, we've taken for granted that we are friendly countries and we will continue to work together, but we're in a situation where now we need to make a very compelling case. And I think there are so many compelling reasons. It's just we need to make a very clear value proposition, put that forward so that we can have a conversation and see ways in which we can support one another. So I'm optimistic, honestly, but we'll see what happens. And again, in the meantime, while we wait for any pronouncements, I think we should be making the case very loud and clear for why countries like Japan, Australia can really contribute, can really make the United States better and stronger.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.